Good morning, everybody. This is another edition of the Passball Show brought to you by JohnPielli.com, by St. Aloysius Church and School in Jackson, New Jersey, by Two Ways. One passion food truck located in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and full stuff we're going to get into today in the world of baseball, sports, and unifying America. Just a reminder, you can download the podcast on iTunes and Google Play. Listen to it whenever you want. We got something like about 100 or so of the near 500 episodes of the PBS up on to the, available to be streamed. Obviously, you can follow any of the videos on YouTube. A couple things we're going to talk about today. We're talking a little basketball, and I was breaking down the top 10 NBA players of all time. I find it fascinating because I feel like I'm pretty good getting up through the first 9. And then the last one, I got a little bit of a debate, so we'll talk about that. I'm going to bring up the 1894 National League baseball season because it's something that, number one, a lot of people don't know too much about, and why I would just pick a random year like that. But there's so many different things that happened and were so fascinating about that season and make it stand out from a lot of other seasons in baseball history. The one thing I'm not going to talk about, and I'm not even going to mention it, now when it comes to what is scaring everybody, what is basically led for everybody to be hidden and hiding under a rock right now, if you want any discussion or breakdown about this, or you want how it relates to sports, go somewhere else. And I suggest you just turn off the freaking program right now, because it's one thing that I'm not going to spend any time talking about today. So, you have a little bit of carousel going on now in the National Football League, and let's be serious. If you can take solace in anything that's going on right now, it's the fact that the NFL is allowed to have an off season. And because of that, there's been a lot of activity, obviously starting with Tom Brady going to the Buccaneers and Teddy Bridgewater heading to the Carolina Panthers. And I think because of those two moves, it's going to set, like I said before, a kind of a carousel or a spiraling out of control of different quarterbacks being in different places. And, I spoke about Brady leaving New England, and if that was going to happen, it was going to lead to a lot of other quarterbacks ending up in different places. Now, the Bridgewater to Carolina is going to expedite that a little bit. It's going to move some more people around. Cam Newton now is going to be playing somewhere else next year. Because Brady is in Tampa Bay, that means Jameis Winston is going to be playing somewhere next year. So it's interesting as you're breaking it down. You got 32 teams in the National Football League, and probably more quarterbacks available either through free agency or through trade than there are viable spots. And one of the things we spoke about before, and it's common knowledge, the NFL draft coming up, and Joe Burrow going to Cincinnati, which is going to basically be a spot where another quarterback is not going to be able to go to. Tua Tagovailoa, likely. Now, anything can happen. We don't know how these drafts are going to work out. A good fit in Miami. You look at the other quarterback, Justin Herbert, likely a good fit with the Los Angeles Chargers at number 5. So you're talking about 3 teams that you figure may be in a market to get one of these quarterbacks. They are probably unlikely to go for the big-time quarterback. Maybe they sign somebody. Maybe a Ryan Fitzpatrick type ends up being there as kind of a mentor or backup. But that leaves guys like Andy Dalton without a home. The Cincinnati Bengals are looking to trade him. They're interested in moving on from him. They want this to be the Joe Burrow era and respect Andy Dalton enough that they'd like to accommodate his wish to play for another football team and have a chance to start there. But the question is going to be, where is it going to be? Now, all of a sudden, there's one opening where a lot of quarterbacks would like to go. And if you say that Tom Brady was a system quarterback, then what better system would you like to walk into than the New England Patriots and Bill Belichick? Now, their longtime offensive line coach has finally retired. Apparently, he's retired for the last time. He's not coming back. So, Dante Scarnecchia is not coming back. Bill Belichick has some influence in the offense, but made his name by being first a special teams guy and then a defensive guy with the Giants. Obviously will go down into history as one of the best head coaches in National Football League history. But the question will remain, is there a system there in New England that next quarterback can go in there and play and succeed? Andy Dalton, could he run that offense and lead that team to 12 to 13 wins and a top 3 seed in the AFC playoffs? Could Cam Newton do it? What type of quarterback does it take to work in that type of system? Maybe somebody that is more run-oriented may not be the best option for New England. But I do think, you talk about the amount of quarterbacks that are out there and the limited amount of openings, I would think the possibility of becoming a starting quarterback for the New England Patriots, it's a pretty interesting task, to say the least. You can talk about the positives, about how good of a spot it would be. That's a nice gig to get. But then again, the expectations are that the Patriots are supposed to continue to be winning. And I don't know what Bill Belichick is looking for in his next quarterback. Phillip Rivers ends up heading to Indianapolis. Nick Foles gets traded to the Chicago Bears. So you're looking at 2 spots, 2 teams that were looking for quarterbacks. All of a sudden, they aren't anymore. So if you're Newton, if you're Winston, if you're Andy Dalton at this point, where is the ideal scenario? And of course, you look at Ryan Tannehill on the Tennessee Titans last year, and him kind of quietly landing the spot there as the backup quarterback to Marcus Mariota. They get off to a 1-3 start. They insert Tannehill. All of a sudden, the Titans start winning and make it to the AFC Championship game. And Tannehill's the long-term quarterback, at least for the time being, for the Tennessee Titans. Marcus Mariota is out. He heads over to Oakland, where John Gruden loves his collection of quarterbacks. Not only is Mariota there with Derek Carr, but Nathan Peterman is still there. And a handful of other quarterbacks that John Gruden enjoys collecting are over there with the Oakland Raiders. So it's going to be interesting. I mean, you could play a game and you could talk about all these different names and write them down as far as what quarterbacks are available in the National Football League right now. You could start, like I said, with Andy Dalton. And then we could go with Jameis Winston, right? You add the likes of, who did I just mention before? Cam Newton will likely be available through a trade. And then you talk about the guys that have landed in spots. Mariota and Brady, Tannehill staying in Tennessee. And it's interesting, you could break this down, and I think you could make a case that each one of these 3 quarterbacks could likely be vying to be the starter in New England. And I would expect New England to draft a quarterback at some point in this draft. Now here's the thing that gets thrown out there, and I think this is a little overblown. The reminder to everybody that Tom Brady was taken in the 6th round, out of the University of Michigan, that the New England Patriots are just going to go like that, go into the draft, grab their next quarterback for the next 20 years in the 6th or 7th round. I think that's completely asinine. That's a silly way to think, and I don't like that take whatsoever. Is New England going to bring somebody in that could possibly be mentored? Absolutely. And if you look at a couple possibilities, one of them, Jimmy Garoppolo, is going to stay in San Francisco. I think there may be more smoke than the actual fire there. I don't know if there was any connection to Tom Brady and the San Francisco 49ers. Maybe Brady would have been interested in going there, but I don't know if there was ever enough from the San Francisco side to say that they were willing to go through with the conspiracy theory that I talked about, moving Garoppolo to New England in a trade for a first-round draft pick, making Brady their starter, maybe trading a couple of their draft picks to get themselves a good quarterback, maybe a top 5 quarterback in this draft in the first round to be able to move up, have their quarterback sit behind Brady for the next year or 2, and have their quarterback for the next 10 to 15 years as opposed to 5 to 10. I don't think that was ever a legitimate possibility. But You look at Jacoby Brissett with the Indianapolis Colts. I would bet that, Brissett, who played admirably, he played okay, he played decent. He wasn't great last year, he was okay. You saw the drop off with Jacoby Brissett behind center, obviously taking over for the great Andrew Luck, who abruptly retired right before the start of the season. But, you wonder if Brissett would be interested in going somewhere else. And, you think about how does Bill Belichick and the New England Patriots, how did they feel about Brissett while he was there as the third stringer behind Brady and Jimmy Garoppolo? That could be a possibility. But I would expect to see the Patriots land somebody like a Newton in a trade, like Dalton in a trade, or sign a guy like Jameis Winston. And I think there are, the other two quarterbacks, unfortunately, are going to be in a spot where they're probably going to be going someplace else to be a backup. Now, one place that would be ideal will be a team that just traded the guy that they spent a lot of money on to be their starting quarterback for the future, and that's Nick Foles. Nick Foles got injured. Nick Foles got beat out by Gardner Minshew. Gardner Minshew is going to get a chance to be the starting quarterback of the Jacksonville Jaguars next year. You may want to be the backup there, because if things don't go right, if the team gets off to a bad start, even if it may not necessarily be Minshew's fault, it'd be a good place to get a chance to start and get a chance to play a little bit. And if I'm Cam Newton, I really wouldn't mind being out there in Jacksonville. Not that far away from Carolina. Of course, there's some miles away, but you're talking about the Southeast. A good spot for Cam Newton to succeed. Doesn't have to change the colors of his uniform that much. I would like to see Cam Newton in Jacksonville with the Jaguars, even if it's a matter of him starting the season as the backup to Gardner Minshew. Remember, Newton's coming off of an injury. He may want to make sure that he's 100% before he goes out there and performs. And it might be a great spot, a great shot, and a great opportunity to play in Jacksonville with the Jaguars. So I think of Winston, and I think of Jameis Winston, the guy who threw 30-plus touchdowns, but also threw 30-plus interceptions last year. Where would the best fit for Jameis Winston be? And I think, you look at a team like the New York Jets, who may want to have a backup to Sam Darnold to make sure that Darnold is healthy. Of course, he dealt with the mononucleosis at the beginning of last year, but also had an up and down type of season. Now, I don't think anybody's going to go over there with the thought of taking over for Sam Darnold. Sam Darnold is going to be the quarterback of the future for the New York Jets for a while, until something major happens. Unless he gets injured, unless the Jets go out there and go 2-14 this year. The New York Football Jets actually had a pretty good finish to last season. They ended up doing a pretty good job. Not bad, considering where they started and where they were at one point, and the fact that they lost to two winless teams over the course of the football season. They were the first victim for the Miami Dolphins. They were the first victim and only victim for the Cincinnati Bengals. So it was you're looking at a Jets season which couldn't have started any worse through the first half, ended up finishing pretty strong. They win 7 games. But I could see Winston in New York backing up Sam Darnold, not in a way to put pressure on him. But remember last year, they had the guy from Denver, Trevor Siemian, as their backup. He ended up getting in a game early, lost for the season. I think if you're the Jets, you want to make sure that you have somebody that has a pedigree, somebody that's proven, somebody that's been a starter in this league. And that's why I think Jameis Winston to the New York Jets makes some sense. So it leads you to Andy Dalton. And Andy Dalton is going to be traded. The Cincinnati Bengals are going to grant him a trade, knowing that they're going to take Joe Burrow with the first overall pick. Now, at some point, you'd want to have a veteran in there that could back up Burrow. Burrow is likely to start right away, but you want to make sure you have somebody there in case, number one, Burrow gets hurt, but also if things don't go well for Joe Burrow. Let's say the offensive line isn't blocking for him and he's at risk of getting hurt. You want to make sure you have somebody that is proven behind center that could go out there and at least hold down the fort until Burrow is ready. That's why I wouldn't mind if the Bengals had held on to Dalton, but I understand why they're going to move on for him and they're going to trade him. And this actually is a chance, a very big chance, that he could go to the New England Patriots and see what this system is all about. Andy Dalton, for several years, has been a starting quarterback of the Cincinnati Bengals and has not gotten very good results. He took the team to the playoffs several years. The team never got past the first playoff game. And, of course, they've struggled over the last couple of years. So Andy Dalton has earned a paycheck. He's established himself as an NFL quarterback, a solid NFL quarterback, a consistent starting NFL quarterback. But it's just kind of been there. This is a chance for him to take his game to the next level. If he could go out there and play under Bill Belichick, play with that New England offense that is set up for the slot receiver, is set up for a tight end. Hopefully they get a tight end this year. And it's set up with a pretty good defense. You wonder how far Andy Dalton can go with it. So I could see Dalton to New England, Winston to the Jets, and Newton I got going to Jacksonville. So we'll see how that ends up working out. This copyright broadcast is authorized under internet rights granted by the World Wide Web and is solely for entertainment of our audience. Any publication, reproduction, or other use of the pictures, descriptions, and accounts of this show without the express written consent of the Passball Show, JohnPLA.com, and John PLA LLC is prohibited. Any commercial or other use of the program, such as by charge of admission for its showing, is similarly prohibited. So once again, you want any coverage about the virus, you want to know what you should do over the next series of days and weeks, you want to know how this virus impacts the world of sports, I suggest you do one thing. Go somewhere else. Turn this show off because I got nothing to say about what's going on with that. The next thing we're going to talk about, I broke this down on johnpla.com. We're doing the top 10 NBA basketball players of all time. And I think it's a relatively easy list to get the majority of them up. And, you know, you can talk about the scorers, you can talk about the big men, but there's a handful of guys that is very, very hard to not include on your list of top 10. And one of the most interesting things about this is this could be one of the more endless debates you could have, excuse me, as we get into the world of sports, because basketball, even though it hasn't stretched back to the days of baseball or even the National Football League, has had many different eras. You talk about the three-point shot, how it's made such a big difference. It's no longer a big man's game now. It's a matter of being able to step behind the arc, shoot a bunch of threes, and that's why you see guys like James Harden succeeding. That's why Russell Westbrook and Harden together are a very good fit with a Houston Rockets team that, you know, a lot of people may not say they're your NBA champions, but you know what? Maybe that connection could work in the postseason. And obviously you're talking about a West, which is very heavy in Los Angeles with both the Lakers and the Clippers, and a very underrated Denver team that few people are talking about. And then there's the Rockets. But I digress, talking about the best basketball players of all time. And two of them I've had the chance to see in my lifetime. And I think it's pretty hard to not start a list with 1 and 2 and one in some way, shape, or form and have Michael Jordan and LeBron James there. I go with Wilt Chamberlain, number 3. And I just think he was so dominant at the time that he played. Just the ability to be at any moment and point the best player on the court. The fact that he just took the ball, took it to the basket, and just basically said, get out of my way. The 100-point game, which I'm not going to get into because I think there's a little bit of a sham behind that. But an effective scorer, the guy averaged 50 points a game in a season one year. It's hard to not talk about the history of the National Basketball Association and not mention Wilt Chamberlain in the top 3. I go 4, Bill Russell, because I just think Bill Russell was so dominant in the time that he played. 11 championships in 13 years. Yes, winning does matter when it comes to listing the top 10 basketball players of all time. And there was no winner in the history of professional sports like Bill Russell. So the next one I go to, the all-time leading scorer in the National Basketball Association history, and that's Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Now, he may not have stood out as, without a doubt, the best player in the game throughout his entire career. He came up at a time where Wilt was still playing. He ended up finishing his career when guys like Magic Johnson and Larry Bird were bursting on the scene. And, Jordan was kind of entering his prime, not quite there yet. He had a career that spanned a long time. But one thing he did, he consistently scored. He was at least to this point, the best scorer in the history of the National Basketball Association. So that's why he is number 5. Number 6, I go with Jerry West, because I think it's so easy to focus on the last couple generations of National Basketball Association players and miss out on a guy who was the logo of the NBA, a guy who stood out as the best basketball player of his time. Jerry West was an effective jump shooter, an effective scorer, an effective all-around NBA player, and it's almost impossible, and I think it's almost negligent if you mention a top 10 when you're talking about the best basketball players in the history of the sport and not mention Jerry West. So after that, I bring up a guy by the name of Oscar Robertson. Oscar Robertson, once again, very good all-around player, the all-time leader in assists until John Stockton broke his record, was really one of the better all-around players in the game. Very hard to not mention Oscar Robertson. Number 8, I'm going to throw a name that may not fit in with a lot of what I've said, and that's Shaquille O'Neal. Shaquille O'Neal, from his days at LSU, from the days he was drafted number 1 overall by the Orlando Magic, was the most dominant force in the National Basketball Association for just about his entire career. Maybe for the exception of his last year where he played with the Boston Celtics and he was just kind of hanging on. He was a force. He couldn't hit a foul shot, but was a big time rebounder. Anytime he had the ball down low, it was pretty similar to Wilt when it comes to the suggestion of just get out of the way. And Shaquille O'Neal, to me, is an easy top 10 basketball player of all time. And next, we'll talk about the late Kobe Bryant. Kobe Bryant, a pure scorer, but a decent all-around player. Showed up in big moments when it came to playing defense. Was not known as the best defensive player on the court, even though he did win some Defensive Player of the Year awards. Was a very dominant player, big-time scorer. And obviously he's going to get a lot of accolades when you talk about one of the best basketball players ever. There's people that talk about the Jordan era, to the Kobe era, to the LeBron era. And there's reasons that people do that. He was so transcending throughout the sport, and it's hard to mention a top 10 without him, though. I think you're getting to a point where you mentioned Shaq at number 8 and you mentioned Kobe at number 9, where we start to get a little bit debatable. Now, you talk about Magic Johnson, 5-time NBA champion, a guy whose career ended prematurely. When I talk about baseball and I give baseball players credit for knowing when to say when. Now, Magic Johnson ideally could have played another 10 years, could have been up there, one of the elite scorers, and could have ranked right up at the top of many statistical categories when his career was over. Obviously, he ends up, getting HIV, reportedly ended up contracting full-blown AIDS, and does have one record. He is the only living human being in the history of the world that has survived full-blown AIDS. And good for him. I hope Magic Johnson lives until he's 150. I think about where he ranks. He's kind of a borderline 10. His contemporary, the great Larry Bird, an excellent scorer, a leader, a winner, deserves some consideration. But one of 2 players that I believe should be number 10 when it comes to the best basketball players of all time are Elgin Baylor and Bob Petit. And I think it's worth talking about Elgin Baylor because a lot of people that follow the National Basketball Association now may not know a whole lot about Elgin Baylor. He played from the years of 1958 through 1972, started his career in the National Basketball Association with the Minneapolis Lakers. They obviously moved over to Los Angeles and before the 1960-61 season, and he ended up playing there through 1972. Elgin Baylor averaged 27.4 points a game, including 3 straight seasons where he averaged more than 34 points a game. His first season in the NBA was a season where he ended up turning around the Minneapolis Lakers. All of a sudden, they finished second. You're looking at a team that was not really known until Elgin Baylor got there. Of course, later on, they'd have the likes of Wilt Chamberlain. So he is drafted as the first pick in the first round of the 1958 draft. And just to look at that draft for a second, you talk about guys like LeBron James and very few other players. Shaquille O'Neal, certainly one of them. Players to be drafted number 1 overall and end up being by far the best player in the draft. And you look at some other players, some other decent players, some players that had some good NBA careers, but there was nobody up there along the lines of Elgin Baylor. Elgin Baylor ended up becoming a dominant force in the NBA. Like I said, averaging 27 points a game, 13.5 rebounds a game, and was a 10-time NBA All-Star, Rookie of the Year, and just a dominant player. So I compare him to another player that could be considered a contemporary to Elgin Baylor. This guy started his career a little bit before, and that's Bob Petit. And Bob Petit, both players are still alive in their mid to late 80s. Bob Petit didn't play as long as Elgin Baylor did, but started his career in 1954 and 1955 with the Milwaukee Hawks. They end up moving to, I believe, St. Louis. Yeah, they moved to St. Louis for the 55-56 season. He ended up spending his career there through 1965. So when you're talking about Magic Johnson maybe getting a little bit of a pass because of the abrupt end of his career, Bob Petit, very dominant over the course of a decade plus. Averaged over 20 points a game in each one of his NBA seasons, averaged over 16 rebounds a game at a time, like I said, when the big man was important. He's a 2-time NBA scoring champ, was Rookie of the Year, 4-time All-Star, 11-time All-NBA, 2-time MVP. And this is, to me, like, this is my Hank Greenberg argument, when it comes to baseball. That Hank Greenberg should be early in the top 20s when it comes to talking about the best baseball players of all time. And you say, hey, Hank Greenberg's career was a little short because of the war and because all of a sudden at one point he was just done. I think you could say the same about Bob Petit. And I think it's very hard to mention a top 10 list when you're talking about the best basketball players of all time and neglect an Elgin Baylor and neglect a Bob Petit. And I'd say they'd have to go at the expense of somebody like a Magic Johnson or Larry Bird. So that would be my top 10 when it comes to best basketball players of all time. I want to hear your own. You could send a message on johnpla.com. You can email me, jrpla@gmail.com. Drop me a line on Twitter. I'll throw it up there and hopefully open this up for a pretty good discussion. But number 1, Jordan. Number 2, LeBron. Number 3, Wilt. Number 4, Russell. Number 5, Kareem. Number 6, West. Number 7, Oscar Robertson. Number 8, Shaq. Number 9, Kobe. And I'm going with Elgin Baylor over Bob Petit at number 10. But my honorable mentions, the ones that are just missing out, are going to be Bob Petit and Magic Johnson. And I'll stick to those two as kind of my 11 and 12 or my 10A and 10B. And I'm willing to open up the discussion. So we'll talk about that over the course of the next week or so. So the last topic that I wanted to bring up today, and this may be the one that'll bore you a little bit. It could. You think about baseball and its history, and a lot of people like to bring stuff up when it comes to the live ball era. And you hear that brought up a lot. A lot of discussion about the live ball era in baseball, how that started around the year of 1920. And Babe Ruth bringing the home runs back in, but also hitters hitting for a little more power. That's when the likes of Rogers Hornsby dominated the sport. After that, you got Gehrig, and all of a sudden, we talk about all players that we could compare to each other. I talk about on this show all the time, baseball being a story about its history, a story about the entirety of its 150 years. So I'm not willing to say, hey, the best players in this era, the best players in this time. When I'm going to compile the top 100 baseball players, offensive position players of all time, I'm talking about from its inception. I'm talking about the best players that played 36-game seasons in the early 1870s in the National Association. I'm talking about the best baseball players in an era where the player that led the league in home runs finished with 8. I'm talking about everything being on the same grading system. Understanding that in some generations, home runs are not as important. In some generations, like now, runs batted in are not important. But those same stats are very valuable at different times over the course of the history of this sport. So I look at the 1894 baseball season, which, by the way, if you want to know who won the National League pennant in 1894, it was the Baltimore Orioles. Now, that may throw some people off right off the bat. Baltimore Orioles, we know, and most good baseball history fans will know that the Baltimore Orioles took over for the St. Louis Browns in the mid-1950s. The St. Louis Browns were the American League team that started in 1901, got to the World Series in 1944, and gave way to what we know as the Baltimore Orioles of the American League right now. Now, the Baltimore Orioles were originally an American League team in 1901. They are a team that was contracted after the 1902 season, and a new team was added in 1903 called the New York Highlanders. But prior to that, prior to the start of the 20th century, there was a Baltimore Oriole team that existed in the National League. And the Baltimore Orioles played from 1882 to 1899. Yes, they were one of the 4 teams contracted after the 1899 season, leading way to what would be called the American League eventually. But the 1894 Baltimore Orioles had some star players, some Hall of Famers, Dan Brothers, Wilbert Robinson, John McGraw, Willie Keeler, Joe Kelly. Their manager was Ned Hanlon. And Ned Hanlon at that time, I just want to see if Ned Hanlon was playing. He may not have been. Let's see. Ned Hanlon as a player played up until... No, he was done playing. So Ned Hanlon, who had a very good career, was a solid player, started his career in 1880 with the Cleveland Blues, then played for the Detroit Wolverines for a series of years, the Pittsburgh Pirates, in the Players League with the Pittsburgh Burgers, the Pirates in 1891, and then finished his career with the Orioles a little bit in 1892 as a player-manager. But Ned Hanlon ends up going into the Hall of Fame as a manager in 1996. So a series of Hall of Famers that are on this team to begin with. The Orioles end up leading the National League with an 89-39 record. That means they finished 50 games over 500. The New York Giants, the Boston Braves, the Philadelphia Phillies, the Brooklyn Grooms, the Cleveland Spiders, all finish with over 500 records. The Pittsburgh Pirates, Chicago Colts, St. Louis Browns, Cincinnati Reds, Washington Senators, and Louisville Colonels all end up having bad seasons last year, the worst of whom was the Louisville club, which went 36-94. So once again, if you're listening to what I'm talking about now and you want to know what is so significant about the 1894 baseball season, there were a total of 3,148 stolen bases that season out of the 12 teams. There were 3,333 strikeouts in the entire season. So there were almost more stolen bases than strikeouts. And I find it ridiculously fascinating that there could be more, anywhere near as many stolen bases as strikeouts, especially in the era that we live in. So here's this point that I'm going to bring up because I needed to verify this off of my Twitter account. In 2019, the most recent season that we had in baseball history, there were 1,133 stolen bases in the National League. 15 teams in the National League. 21,048 strikeouts. In fact, in the American League, there was, I think, 21,400 something strikeouts. So you're talking about 42,000 strikeouts in Major League Baseball in 2019. Now, I understand the National League was running by itself at the time. So you're only talking about 12 teams as opposed to 30 teams in Major League Baseball. I get it, but I'm splitting it up. We're talking about the National League in 1894 against the National League of 2019. 12 teams in 1894. 15 teams in 2019. 3,333 strikeouts. 12 teams in 1894. 21,048 strikeouts. 15 teams, 2019. 3,148 stolen bases. 12 teams in 1894. 15 teams in 2019. There were 1,133 stolen bases. Hugh Duffy for the Boston Braves hit 340, was 237 out of 539, had a .502 on-base percentage, a .694 slugging percentage, 160 runs scored, 51 doubles, 14 triples, 16 home runs, 145 runs batted in 125 games. I spent some time talking about Gus Schmeltz, who we'll bring up in another show. The runs scored leaders in the National League in 1894. Patsy Donovan was 10th with 147. Ed Delahanty was 9th with 148. Jake Stenzel and Bill Dolan were 7th and 8th with 150. John McGraw was 6th with 156. Bobby Lowe was 5th with 158. Bobby Lowe played for the Boston team. So did Hugh Duffy, who had 160. Joe Kelly was tied for second with Willie Keeler, both of the Baltimore Orioles with 165. And the player that led the National League in runs scored in 1894 was sliding Billy Hamilton with 198. 198 runs scored. There's never been any more runs scored in a single season in baseball history. Next point I want to bring up. In 1894, it was the year of the hitter. The Philadelphia Phillies had 3 outfielders, an entire outfield. A Philly team that ended up finishing 4th in the National League had an entire outfield that hit over 400. Sam Thompson hit 415. Billy Hamilton hit 403. Ed Delahanty hit 405. Never in baseball history has there ever been an outfield where all 3 players have hit over 400. And this season, obviously known as an offensive season, I think the collective batting average was over 300 in the entire league. The amount of runs per game were highest in baseball history at 7.38, which meant that pitching was not too good. The collective ERA was 5.33 for anybody that pitched in baseball. In fact, there were a total of 13,831 innings pitched. There were a total of 11,796 runs scored. Now, 8,187 of them were earned, but you're talking about an a run average, which would have been over 7. The earned run average is over 5, but the amount of runs that were scored meant that each team was giving up 7 runs per game. So the reason I bring this up is because there was only one pitcher, one qualified pitcher in the National League that finished the season with an earned run average under 3.7. And that was New York Giants pitcher Amos Rusi, who had a 2.78 ERA. He would have been the Cy Young, obviously at a time where Cy Young was pitching. I believe he was pitching for the Cleveland Club at that time. But he would have been the Cy Young that year. It was 36-13, completed 45 out of 50 of his starts, and led the league in walks with 200, which may not be a good thing, but it's interesting. Strikeouts with 195, and ERA plus of 188, which is obviously adjusted for the ballparks. So an interesting season. I'm going to do a little more writing about the 1894 season. If you have any interest in it, that'll be my next blog post. You'll see that up on johnpla.com. A little bit of a recap of the show today. We're playing a little carousel when it comes to the quarterbacks of the National Football League. Tom Brady going to New England, Teddy Bridgewater going to Carolina, which only is going to spiral the thing a little more out of control, leaving guys like Jameis Winston and Cam Newton without jobs. I predict Newton will end up in Jacksonville. Winston will end up backing up Sam Darnold with the Jets. And Andy Dalton will be the next quarterback of the New England Patriots. Now, listen, I could be wrong. This is just my hypothesis or my prediction. See how it ends up working out. I did predict Brady would have ended up in Tampa Bay a couple weeks ago. So I had that going for me. We'll see how these other predictions go. Talk about the top 10 basketball players in the history of the sport. You got the list up on johnpla.com if you're interested in it. I'll run it by you real quick. Jordan, James, Chamberlain, Russell, Abdul-Jabbar, West, Robertson, Shaq, Kobe, Elgin Baylor. Honorable mention, Magic Johnson, and Bob Petit. Talk about the 1894 baseball season, which I think is so fascinating in so many different ways, from stolen bases to lack of strikeouts to offensive surges, players hitting over 400. One of the best seasons in baseball history that nobody talks about. We'll be back with you Saturday, and I promise you, we're going to stick to sports. Anybody that wants to hear any opinion about this virus and what they should do and how it impacts sports, I suggest you just turn this off and go somewhere else, because we're not going to talk about it here. We'll be back with you Saturday. This is the Pass Ball Show, brought to you by johnpla.com, by Two Ways, One Passion Food Truck located in Scranton, Pennsylvania, by St. Aloysius Church and School in Jackson, New Jersey. You can download the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, subscribe to my YouTube channel. God bless you. And as always, I'll see you on the other side.